Hello, everyone. This is Factor coming at you from the one and only DC University. In today's video, let's reminisce on the past and talk about the updates to DC Universe Online that changed PvP forever and led us where we are today. Why not start this video off with a bang and talk about quite possibly the most controversial update ever in DC Universe Online? Of course, I'm talking about Game Update 36. This update was one of the most impactful and polarizing updates ever in the game, and there were three main reasons for this. The first one was the standardization of weapon attacks and counters. Prior to the update, two-handed brawling and rifle could all block break with their tap ranged attack, and some weapons were even capable of AoE block breaks. This weapon pass made it so that these weapons would get faster animations. All weapons, except for Hand Blaster for some reason, will lose their ability to AoE block break, and on top of that, Rifle would now gain the ability to block break with its hold range attack. While two-handed remained a weak weapon, Brawling would become even more popular among PvPers, and Rifle would quickly rise alongside dual wield and one-handed as the most popular weapon types for PvP. The second big part of this update was the changes to AoE abilities. Previously, the amount of enemies AoE abilities could hit was inconsistent and varied wildly between abilities, with some abilities being able to hit up to 20 targets, while others would only be able to hit up to 4. Game Update 36 made it so all standard AoE abilities would always hit up to 8 targets, while all supercharge abilities would always hit up to 20 targets. This might not seem like a big deal looking through the lens of today, but back then, the larger arena sizes like 4v4, 5v5, and 8v8 were all popular modes, and some maps such as Arkham Asylum and Safe House Recovery had NPCs to further increase the available targets. The last and probably biggest part of Game Update 36 were the changes to clipping and jump canceling. We would no longer be able to instantly begin casting an ability or weapon attack after canceling an animation, and instead we were forced to wait between 0.8 to 1.3 seconds from the start of the animation before we would be allowed to attack again. This change impacted almost every single combat ability in the entire game, and would force pretty much everyone, but especially DPS players, to go back to the drawing board with their rotations. Many people within the DC community were pissed at the change. They felt it removed a lot of the skill expression from the game. Before this update, the game had a much faster pace. Quick and accurate button presses were at the forefront when it came to how you would judge a player's skill. Okay, so now let's talk about Game Update 28. There's one really large change I'm going to be talking about, but first let's talk about a couple of smaller parts of this update. The devs added the small icons that show up above your head whenever you're doing an action that can be countered. This provided more clarity to what your opponent was doing and what you needed to do in order to land a counter, assisting new players who were learning the basics of combat. It was also much easier to fight against players that were good at clipping, as it was always clear what your opponent was vulnerable to regardless of what animation their character was doing. There was also a nerf to the counter immunity buff, also known as the blue buff, that capped the damage resistance to 20% of your maximum health. This change really didn't impact one-on-one fights very much, but it was now noticeably more difficult to deal with multiple enemies targeting you at once, even if you're landing counters. Your opponents could simply burn through your blue buff rather quickly compared to previously, where it was almost impossible to do. Now onto the meat and potatoes of Game Update 28. The role debuff system was completely reworked, and in my opinion, it was put into a significantly more balanced state, and many people look fondly over PvP in the 2013 to 2014 time period because of this update to the role debuffs. They removed the rock, paper, scissors systems, where tanks would have the advantage against controllers, controllers against healers, and healers would do well against tanks. Arenas have been based around this mechanic for a really long time, so to completely remove it was a pretty hard change for some players to get used to. But not to worry, role debuffs weren't removed completely. They would instead be moved to the movement tree ability. This meant that no matter what power set you were using, you had access to all 3 role debuffs. The role debuffs would remove shielding effects and prevent new ones from being applied for 6 seconds, as well as reduce the target's defense, vitalization, and restoration temporarily depending on the role of the player you targeted. Gone were the days where you would feel as though you were insurmountable disadvantaged simply because you were playing as hard light against an ice tank, for example. Looking back, many of us appreciated this update. However, it wasn't free of its fair share of controversy and criticism. Many healer and tank players were very upset. Healers were the first ones targeted in almost every fight, but didn't have much to defend themselves with, and tank players couldn't get as much value from their shields, with several players spamming debuffs on them all the time. This led to a meta where DPSs and controllers were clearly on top, with tanks, healers, and players that relied heavily on shields and heals struggling. The next thing I'm going to talk about wasn't technically a game update, but instead it was an entire DLC, or what we now refer to as an episode. I'm of course talking about DLC 4, The Last Laugh, which was released in the summer of 2012, and to this day is one of the most unique DLCs in the entire game, in terms of the content that it offered. To summarize the storyline of the episode, the Joker, frustrated by alliances forming between heroes and villains, obtains access codes to their safe houses, the Watchtower and police station for heroes, and the Hall of Doom and nightclubs for villains. He then shares this code with all members involved in the conflict. The action sparks a series of battles between heroes and villains as they are attempted to invade and shut down each other's headquarters in an arena's PvP setting. We got several new PvP maps, a slew of Legends characters, as well as the new shield weapon, making this the largest content drop for PvP we had ever seen before or since. The DLC was priced at the standard price of around $10 US currency. Though the exact numbers are private, this DLC unfortunately sold much worse than the other DLC packs of the time, such as Battle for Earth, Origin Crisis, and Fight for the Light. The poor sales of the Last Laugh DLC likely led to the publishers and dev team avoiding making another paid PvP DLC in the future, and instead looking to other methods of monetizing PvP in the game, such as trying to sell more replay badges. Looking back on the Last Laugh DLC, I think a big issue was how it fragmented the player base. If you wanted to play on any of the DLC maps, you had to make sure that everyone in the group was either a legendary subscriber or had purchased the Last Laugh. Another issue that I saw when I was actually playing is that these maps came with new objective types other than the standard capture the point and deathmatch modes. Whenever I would solo queue, there would be players that didn't understand the objective, and those players would rarely be helpful, or in the case of Safe House Rescue, could accidentally score points for the enemy team. These issues put together helped create a situation where queuing these maps would often lead to absurdly long queue times and bad experiences when you actually managed to get into a game. Looking back, I enjoyed the memories of playing the DLC maps when they first came out, but ended up regretting my purchase as there was simply better DLC worth purchasing at the time. And last, but definitely not least, we have Game Update 41. And it had a few major changes to the ways arenas worked. Outside trinkets and consumables were completely banned, and the only things we were allowed to bring into arenas were the Soda Cola Infinite and the PvP Breakout Trinket. Some people liked the simplicity that this added to arenas, while other people were upset that some strategic diversity was removed from the game. I personally found it annoying as I had crafted several consumables specifically to use in PvP, and I was suddenly not allowed to use them. But consumables and trinkets were the only things to be banned in PvP. Home turf gear mods were also not able to be used in PvP anymore, which myself, alongside most other people, were happy about, because things like Explosive Block and Absorption Adapter were extremely annoying to play against. Game Update 41, also introduced PvP stat minimums. The community as a whole seemed to have mixed feelings about this part of the update. On one hand, players that didn't have PvP gear now could put up a decent fight, as the gap between the lowest set of PvP gear available and not wearing any PvP gear at all was made pretty small. On the other hand, many players were upset that another advantage that they had grinded, and in some cases played hundreds or even thousands of games, was being taken away, and new players wouldn't have to grind nearly as hard to get to the same point. The stat minimums also opened the door for the meta chasers to make fresh tunes and instantly be competitive in arenas, instead of having to pay real money for a respec token. I personally like this change because many PvP players that relied heavily on stats and weren't actually good at the game were exposed as the frauds they were, and it allowed the truly good players to rise to the top regardless of skill points or gear. Of course, you can't talk about Game Update 41 without talking about the most controversial change of the update, and one of the most damaging updates to PvP as a whole in my opinion, which of course is role debuffs being removed from the game. No longer would your movement mode abilities remove shields and healing effects, meaning that tanks and healers who struggled in the meta for a while were now viable again. Because of this, it was much more difficult to defeat players that use lots of heals and shields, leading to the slower, wet noodle style of fighting. Now, to be fair, the developers who worked on this update did try to prevent this from happening by reducing the effectiveness of shields, removing the vitalization bonus from controller role, and reducing healing output in the healer role by about 20%, but it simply wasn't enough. Looking back on things, Game Updates 41's removal of role debuffs is one of the biggest reasons why PvP is in its current state. It simply made arenas much less fun to play, especially if you preferred playing DPS role and didn't queue up with pre-made teams. There are many more things I could talk about in a video like this, such as the PlayStation PC server merge, the several blue immunity changes, the addition and rework of the weapon mastery system, as well as advanced mechanics to powers, so I might make a part 2. Thanks for watching, and please like, subscribe, and leave a comment.